Hey there. So next thing we're going to do is go over what is Amazon EC2. I don't expect you at the end of this to really know a lot about how to use Amazon EC2. It's more like understanding what it is. So basically EC2 is VMs in the AWS cloud. EC2 stands for Elastic Compute Cloud, and it's Amazon's way to provide a service to you so that you can very quickly build instances to support your applications faster. That's really what it is. You can launch as many or a few as you need. You can do there's a whole bunch of automation type stuff you can set up with rules that make it super slick. And you can do all of your security, networking, storage, everything from EC2. So it's super powerful service. I'd say this and S3 are probably the two most frequently used services, and so I think that it would be appropriate if you're learning AWS to know these probably better than any of the other services, depending on what your job function is. Um, what does it allow you to do? So you can scale up, you can scale down, you can do things like watch your network traffic or application requests to figure out where things need to be routed. So it's pretty powerful. EC2 has a lot of capabilities and it works really well with a lot of the other Amazon services. Tons of services touch EC2, so it's important to know also kind of how it's used in conjunction with other services. The topics on this page are covered here. I'm just going to briefly go over them. VMs in Amazon are called instances. And if you have a template that has an instance that specifically has like all of the exact operating system or even some applications that you want, you can get that with something called an Amazon machine image or an AMI, which is just an instance template. There are different versions of the instances that you can have that are focused on like high compute or high memory or high I/O storage or networking and things like that, and those are all instance types. You log into them with a key pair, so similar to how you would use a private and public key for SSH. They have their own way of doing that as well. A couple different options there we'll go over later. You've got storage volumes. There's two different types. You've got ephemeral data, which is temporary data that's deleted anytime you stop, hibernate, or delete an instance. And those are instance store volumes. And then you've got your persistent storage volumes, which is the EBS volumes or Elastic Block Store. You've also can create instances all over the world in physical regions of the world, hence the name regions here. And within that region, you have zones, availability zones. And you'll have a region, say in Virginia is the US East 1 region. And there's going to be multiple availability zones inside that region so that if anything were to happen, a hurricane comes by, some flood or whatever, a power outage, that you can design your applications with some failover capability for high availability, and you can actually spread those out over multiple availability zones to give yourself a little bit of security there. You can configure your firewalls on an instance, although it's not called a firewall, it's called a security group. A group not to be associated or confused with groups of people, which is a totally different thing that I'll cover later. But a security group is a firewall, just know that. If you need a static IPv4 address for a dynamic cloud computing, all right, so you got instances going up and down and whatnot, you can reuse a static IP address called an elastic IP address. More on that later. And you can also add metadata, so you can tag your instances with key value pairs. It's like a JSON format, and you can give it a key like department and a value of finance or HR or development or whatever. And that's handy for being able to programmatically deploy Amazon resources, EC2 instances specifically, where you can tag them and see what you have and people know who made it. And you can also use that on the finance side. There's many other uses, but those are the two most popular. So you can figure out when you look at your bill, you can look at it by tag and figure out, well, where are these costs coming from? And you can even create budgets to give each department a different budget. And then based on the tags, you can kind of figure out, okay, this is where this is coming from. Or you can create separate accounts for them as well. We'll get into that later. but just know that that's a feature that's available is tags. And then everything is built inside of a VPC, which is kind of like your own little mini cloud. It's a virtual private cloud. You can assign a CIDR range, allocate subnets with your own subnet ranges, and it could be anything. It doesn't matter. The IPs could be 10.0.0.0, and everyone and their mother could use that for the VPC, and that's fine because there are ways to translate that to be able to connect one VPC to another VPC, or to connect one on-prem data center to an AWS VPC. So there's a lot of options there, but just know that the virtual network that all of your Amazon EC2 instances would reside inside of a virtual private cloud. All of the options on this documentation, if you start going through it, are actually listed here, but I think the order of this makes a little bit more sense. It's very easy to jump around and kind of get lost. And so sometimes that's a great way to learn, but I'm going to go ahead and just stick to the page and skip all this because these are all covered off here, which I will cover in a different session. The idea is I'm going to try to keep these very short so you can just kind of go through what you need. You can go through all of them. You can just go through little parts of them if you're trying to get deeper knowledge or whatever. So how to get started. So get up and running, basics, networking, all this. It's just all the same stuff over here. So I'm going to skip past all of this and go over it later, and we'll go down to related services. It's important to know, like I said before, that EC2 is tied into many of Amazon's other resources on AWS. So whether that's autoscaling or CloudFormation, which is basically like their version of Terraform, or Elastic Beanstalk, OpsWorks, all these things use EC2 under the hood. So you have to know how EC2 works and what it is in order to know how CloudFormation works. So it's just kind of like a building block that you have to kind of get your head around. Automatically distributing traffic, you can use elastic load balancing. So you can actually load balance your traffic based on different criteria across different EC2 instances. You also have the option to have a managed database. So if you work in VMware or somewhere on-prem, you might be used to building an instance, or even some people that migrated to the cloud and they just did a lift and shift and they haven't really built out like a service-oriented architecture or SOA. So if you are used to building a server and then downloading the binaries for the database and then installing the database and configuring it, and you have to be responsible for knowing best practice and to building it securely and all that stuff. Well, there's a service called RDS that you can use that we'll talk about later, that will manage everything below the database for you, so you can just worry about the actual tables and indexes and all that other stuff. You don't have to worry a lot about performance tuning and all those things, patching, things like that. But under the hood is EC2, so you gotta have to know EC2. Same thing goes for containers. It's kind of like the same concept as databases. Pretty much everything as a service on Amazon. Database as a service. So think of Elastic Container Service as like containers as a service. So all the underlying hosts for your Docker containers would be managed by Amazon as well. But you don't have to worry about it. But it's good to know that these are running on a cluster of EC2 instances. If you're trying to get monitoring or any kind of high-level security, there are services in AWS as well. You can use CloudWatch, for example, for monitoring, and understanding how to use these different services in the context of EC2 is important for understanding EC2. So knowing what CloudWatch is and how it works is great, but knowing how to use it and what the capabilities are for EC2 specifically will be different than what it does for Amazon S3 or for any other resource. So then for accessing EC2, you got a couple different options. You can go through the web GUI. You can go through their CLI using the Amazon SDK. It's just like a way to programmatically access your resources. There's actually tools for PowerShell now that didn't used to exist. And then you can template stuff out, just like I said with Terraform, except CloudFormation uses JSON and YAML instead of HashiCorp language, so that's kind of nice. Especially because if you don't want to learn HCL, then that's kind of convenient because JSON and YAML very easy to read, very portable, and Google services like Deployment Manager also use JSON YAML, so you can move those over, and with some minor tweaking, probably be able to I wouldn't say call it cloud agnostic, but be able to at least port your template over, and with some minor changes be able to do that. The downside, obviously, HashiCorp, it's a different provider, but it's more cloud agnostic, I think. So you can also get in with querying via API, another programmatic way to access resources for GET, post requests, all kind of stuff. And if your shop builds stuff in a specific language, like you use JavaScript or Go or whatever, there are some APIs you can use natively to whatever language you choose that would help you out there too. So then you've got pricing. The pricing there's a couple different categories, and I'll go into this in more detail later, but just know that you can spin something up on demand, and that has a certain cost. You can save by reserving instances. If you know that it's going to be up for a year or 2 years or 3 years, you can just buy all that time at once and save a ton of money. Part of the whole operating in the cloud bit, one of the benefits is that you can trade capital expense for variable expense, right? So you kind of have to balance whether or not having a reserved instance is right for you, especially if you're a small company, you don't have a lot of capital. You might need to use on-demand instances, or if you've got workloads, spot instances, which is basically where you just make a bid and it'll spin the instance up if the current going price is under whatever your limit is. So yeah, there's a couple different options there. Just know that you've got some options, and there's calculators and stuff for trying to figure out, well, how much is this going to cost for a month or for a year or whatever. And they've got a dashboard that does a great job of projecting that, so you can figure out what you can expect at the end of the month and look at month over month and set up budgets and billing alarms if you go over certain thresholds. And so EC2, it's very easy to manage. It could be kind of scary to build something like that and then wonder, well, how much is this going to cost me? But it'll actually tell you when you build an EC2 instance, like, hey, based on what you selected, this is going to cost, X dollars and Y cents a month. So and then the last part is regulatory compliance frameworks, and you've got PCI DSS. So if you do credit card transactions, EC2 is already PCI DSS compliant. So if you're using something like platform as a service, where you're running something on EC2 instances like RDS or something like that, under the hood, your infrastructure is already PCI DSS compliant. If you're running your own fleet of EC2 instances, then you can also rest assured that the instance is PCI DSS compliant, which saves a lot of time, because if you've ever been through an audit for FedRAMP or PCI or if HIPAA or any of the other stuff, you know that it can be quite time consuming and a little bit of a pain, especially if you're not a security person. So anyways, that's it for the overview on what is Amazon EC2, and I'm going to go ahead and stop here and we'll pick it back up in the next section. Thanks.